The galaxy was quiet. It had been quiet for 49,000 years. Everyone said this was good. The great leaders of the hegemony told all the worlds that peace was the highest goal. War was bad. Fighting was wrong. The smart races had learned to live together without anger or violence. On thousands of planets, beautiful cities reached toward the stars. The buildings were made of crystal that glowed with soft light. The Zephyrians ruled with their mind powers, always knowing what others were thinking. The Vorthak were machines that thought like one giant brain. The Luminari were beings made of pure energy who floated through space like living stars. Together, these three races controlled everything. Every species had its place. The bird-like Cathari sang beautiful songs in the crystal towers. The rock people called granites built strong foundations for cities. Small fuzzy creatures named pillow folk made soft beds and comfortable chairs. Everyone was happy. Everyone had food. Nobody fought anymore. But there were old stories, whispered in dark corners of space stations. Stories about a race that had lived long ago. They called themselves humans. These humans had been dangerous. They fought each other with terrible weapons. They burned their own planet with atomic fire. In the end, they destroyed themselves completely. The galaxy was safer without them. The hegemony kept records of these humans in secret places. Only the highest leaders could read these files. The record showed pictures of humans. They looked like tall, hairless apes with strange ideas. They had built machines that could fly between stars, but they also built bombs that could kill millions. They were too violent to live in the peaceful. Galaxy Dr. Zenth, a Zephyrian historian, often looked at these old records. She studied the human homeworld called Earth. The files showed it as a burned rock floating in space, empty and dead. Sometimes she wondered what the humans might have become if they had learned to be peaceful like everyone else. But humans were gone forever. That was what everyone believed. In the far edges of the galaxy, where space became strange and dark, something moved. The area was called the Void region. Most ships avoided it because their instruments stopped working there. The few brave explorers who went into the void never came back. The hegemony had marked it as forbidden territory generations ago. Deep in this darkness, old machines suddenly came to life. Ancient monitoring stations that had been sleeping for thousands of years started sending signals. The signals were weak at first, like whispers in the night. Then they grew stronger. Commander Vex of the Hegemony Border Guard was drinking his morning nutrition paste when the alarm started. His ship, the Peaceful Dawn, was patrolling the edge of the Void region. Nothing interesting ever happened here. It was the most boring assignment in the fleet. "Commander," his communications officer called out. "We're receiving something strange." Vex walked over to look at the readings. The screens showed energy patterns that made no sense. They were too big, too powerful. "Must be an equipment error," he said. "Run a full diagnostic." But the readings kept coming. Soon, every sensor they had was screaming warnings. Something massive was moving in the Void region. Not just one thing, hundreds of things. Each signal was the size of a small moon. Then, the communication came through. The voice was clear and strong, speaking in an ancient language that the ship's computer had to translate. "This is Admiral Chen of the Terran Exodus Fleet. We have traveled far from home. We have seen the darkness between galaxies. We have learned truths that will shake the foundations of your perfect world. We are returning to the galaxy of our Earth. We are coming home." Commander Vex stared at the translation with growing fear. Terran was the old word for human, but humans were extinct. They had been gone for 50,000 years. Everyone knew this. The communication continued. "To the hegemony of ascended races, we know what you did. We know the lies you told. We know the truth about our people and about yourselves. Your time of false peace is ending." More signals appeared on the sensors. Hundreds became thousands. The things moving in the Void region were ships, bigger than anything the hegemony had ever built. They moved in perfect formation, like a school of deadly fish swimming through dark water. Vex tried to contact Hegemony Command, but his signals were being blocked by some kind of interference. The human ships were jamming everything. He could only watch as the impossible fleet emerged from the void region and began moving toward the heart of the galaxy. On the flagship of the human fleet, Admiral Chen stood looking at the stars through a massive window. She was old now, with gray hair and lines on her face. She had been born during the long journey between galaxies. Her grandparents had been among the humans who escaped when their homeworld was attacked. "Ma'am," her aide said softly, "we're receiving surrender requests from 17 hegemony patrol ships." Chen nodded. "Tell them we're not here to destroy them. We're here to free them. But first, they need to learn the truth." Behind her, the Yo bridge of the ship hummed with activity. Human crew members worked at stations that looked nothing like hegemony technology. Everything was angular, practical, built for war and long journeys. The walls were covered with the names of the dead. Billions of humans who had died in the long exile. "Begin the broadcast," Chen ordered. Across the galaxy, on every world and every ship, the same message began to play. It started with images, old pictures from the hegemony's own secret files. Pictures that showed human cities burning not from their own weapons, but from hegemony attack ships. Pictures of human children being loaded onto transport vessels. Pictures of human leaders being executed in hegemony prison camps. The message was simple. The humans did not destroy themselves. They were driven out, and now they have returned to show the galaxy what really happened 50,000 years ago. The peaceful galaxy was about to learn that its peace had been built on lies, and that the most dangerous species in its history had spent 50 millennia becoming something even more terrifying than anyone had imagined. In the crystal cities, alarms began to ring. The age of false peace was ending. The age of truth was about to begin. The human fleet was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Their ships were dark and angular, made from metals that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. Where hegemony vessels were smooth and beautiful like works of art, human ships looked like weapons. Every surface had a purpose, every line spoke of function over beauty. The largest ship was called the Unbroken. It was bigger than most space stations. Along its hull, millions of names were carved in tiny letters, the names of every human who had died during the 50,000-year exile. The ship itself was a memorial to the dead. Captain Sarah Martinez commanded a smaller vessel called the Indomitable. She had been chosen to make first contact with the hegemony because she was good with words. Her ship approached the hegemony border station where Commander Vex was still trying to understand what was happening. "Unknown vessel," Vex transmitted. "You are entering hegemony space without permission. Please state your intentions." Sarah's response was calm but firm. "Commander Vex of the Peaceful Dawn, we are humans returning to our home galaxy. We come not as conquerors, but as witnesses. We have truths to share that will change everything you believe about your perfect civilization." Vex had studied some human history in the academy. According to his lessons, humans were violent primitives who had barely learned to travel between stars before destroying themselves. But the ship in front of him was clearly more advanced than anything the hegemony could build. "Impossible," Vex said. "Humans are extinct. The records clearly show they destroyed their homeworld 50,000 years ago." Sarah's laugh came through the communication system. It was not a happy sound. "Commander, that is exactly what we expected you to believe. May we share some information with you? I think you'll find it very interesting." Before Vex could answer, his ship's computers began receiving a massive data package. The information was compressed but clearly organized. When his systems decoded it, Vex found himself looking at video recordings that made his blood turn cold. The recordings were from the hegemony's own archives, but they showed events that were not in any official history. He watched hegemony ships attacking human colonies. He saw human families being separated and loaded onto prison ships. He watched human leaders being executed not as criminals, but as examples to others who might resist hegemony rule. "These files cannot be real," Vex whispered, but his ship's computer confirmed their authenticity. The encryption was definitely hegemony military grade, and the timestamps were 50,000 years old. The humans never destroyed themselves, Commander, Sarah explained. They were driven out of the galaxy by the hegemony. A small fleet escaped into the darkness between galaxies. They have spent 50 millennia growing stronger, learning, and preparing for this day. More human ships appeared on Vex's sensors. They moved with perfect coordination, like a single organism. Each ship was scarred from long journeys, but their weapon systems were clearly active and more powerful than anything in the hegemony fleet. On the hegemony capital world of New Zenith, the leaders were meeting in emergency session. The ruling council consisted of representatives from the three major races. Zephyrian mind speaker Aelin sat at the crystal table, her large eyes glowing with mental energy. Beside her, the Vorthak unit designated Prime 7 hummed with electronic thoughts. At the head of the table, the luminari being called Golden Dawn flickered between different colors of light. The situation is unprecedented, Prime 7 announced in its mechanical voice. Our sensors confirm the presence of over 10,000 vessels of unknown design. Their technology appears to be significantly more advanced than our own. Mind speaker Aelin nodded slowly. I have attempted to read their thoughts, but their minds are shielded. It is as if they have learned to hide their intentions even from telepathic scanning. Golden Dawn pulsed with worried orange light. If these really are the descendants of the ancient humans, then we face a serious problem. Our historical records may need to be revised. The three leaders looked at each other with growing concern. The hegemony's power was based on the belief that they had created a perfect, peaceful civilization. If the galaxy learned that this peace was built on lies and violence, everything could collapse. We must control the situation quickly, Golden Dawn decided. Begin broadcasting on all channels. Tell the galaxy that these are imposters, probably terrorists from the Outer Rim. The real humans destroyed themselves long ago, just as our histories record. But even as the hegemony began its propaganda campaign, human ships were appearing throughout the galaxy. They did not attack or threaten. Instead, they simply existed, like ghosts returning from the dead. On every world, people stopped their daily activities to look up at the sky and wonder what these dark ships meant. Dr. James Okafor stood in the command center of the human ship, Remembrance. He was the fleet's chief historian, and he had spent his entire life studying the records that the evacuating humans had taken with them 50,000 years ago. Now he was finally home, ready to share the truth with a galaxy that had forgotten its own past. Begin the transmission, he ordered. Across every communication channel in the galaxy, Dr. Okafor's voice began to speak. He was a tall, dark-skinned man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, but his words carried the weight of 50 millennia of exile. People of the galaxy, he began, my name is James Okafor, and I am a human being. For 50,000 years, you have been told that my people destroyed themselves in nuclear fire. This is a lie. We were driven from our homes by the very leaders who now promise you peace and prosperity. Images began to accompany his words. Pictures of human Earth before the hegemony arrived. Green and blue and beautiful, full of diverse cultures and amazing cities. Then pictures of the same world after the hegemony's pacification, empty and gray, its people gone. The hegemony did not find us after we had destroyed ourselves, Dr. Okafor continued. They destroyed us because we refused to give up our independence, because we would not accept their version of peace, which required us to stop thinking for ourselves. On 1,000 worlds, people watched these images with growing shock. Many of the recordings came from the hegemony's own security cameras. There was no way to fake the evidence Dr. Okafor was presenting. We did not return to seek revenge, the human historian said softly. We returned because we learned something during our long exile. We learned that the hegemony has done to dozens of other species exactly what they did to us. We learned that your perfect peace is built on the bones of anyone who dared to disagree. The broadcast continued for hours, showing evidence after evidence of hegemony crimes. By the time it ended, the galaxy was no longer the same place it had been that morning. Seeds of doubt had been planted in millions of minds, and those seeds were beginning to grow. In the Crystal Cities, some people began to ask questions they had never thought to ask before, and in the depths of space, the human fleet waited patiently for those questions to bloom into something that could change everything. The truth spread like fire across the galaxy. On every world, in every city, people gathered around communication screens to watch the evidence that humans were sharing. The files were impossible to ignore because they came from the hegemony's own computers, sealed with encryption codes that only the highest leaders could use. On the mining world of Keros 5, a group of granites stopped their work to watch the broadcasts. These rock people had always been told they were naturally suited for heavy labor, that their thick skin and strong bodies made them perfect miners. But the human recordings showed something different. "Look at this," rumbled Granite Foreman Thek, pointing at the screen with one massive stone finger. "This shows our ancestors before the hegemony came. They were not just miners, they were artists, builders, philosophers. They created beautiful sculptures and wrote poetry." The other granites gathered closer. In the recordings they could see their people's ancient cities. Not the simple mining colonies they lived in now, but complex structures that reached toward the sky like frozen music. Their ancestors had been so much more than workers. "What happened to us?" asked a younger granite named Vel. "Why do we only know how to dig rocks from the ground?" Thek's rocky face showed an emotion that granites were not supposed to feel: anger. "According to these files, the hegemony decided we were better suited for simple work. They gave our people treatments to make us less interested in complicated thinking." Similar scenes were happening across the galaxy. The bird-like Cathari discovered that their ancestors had not just been singers, but warriors and scientists. The Pillow Folk learned that their people had once been fierce traders who traveled between stars in their own ships. Every species was finding out that they had been changed, reduced, made smaller than they once were. Dr. Okafor continued his broadcast from the human ship, Remembrance. Each day brought new revelations, new proof of what the hegemony had done. But the most shocking discovery was still to come. "Today we will share the story of the broken worlds," Dr. Okafor announced during his 5th broadcast. "These are planets that the hegemony claims never existed, species that supposedly never evolved. But we have proof that they were real, and we know what happened to them." The screen filled with images of beautiful worlds, planets with purple skies and silver, oceans, forests that grew in spirals reaching toward 3 different suns, cities that floated in clouds of colored gas. These were the broken worlds, and they were incredible. The Melody were a species that communicated through colors that changed on their skin, Dr. Okafor explained, as images showed creatures that looked like living rainbows. They refused to use verbal language because they said words were too crude for real communication. The hegemony decided this was inefficient and tried to force them to speak normally. When the Melody refused, the hegemony declared them mentally defective and relocated them to treatment facilities. Within a generation, the entire species was extinct. Their homeworld was strip-mined for resources, and all records of their existence were erased from hegemony databases. The images showed what remained of the Melody homeworld: a dead rock floating in space, its surface scarred by massive mining operations. Dr. Okafor's voice remained calm as he continued, but those who listened carefully could hear the deep sadness beneath his words. "The dancers were beings of pure energy who lived in the cores of stars," he went on. "They harmed no one and asked nothing from other species except to be left alone. But the hegemony wanted to study them, to learn how to control stellar energy. When the dancers refused to cooperate, the hegemony used special weapons to trap them in containment fields. The recordings showed hegemony scientists studying the captured dancers, beings of light who grew dimmer and dimmer as they were held against their will. One by one, they simply faded away until their stars went cold and dark. 7 stellar systems went dark because the hegemony valued knowledge more than life," Dr. Okafor said quietly. "And then they erased all evidence that the dancers had ever existed. On world after world, people watched these revelations with growing horror. The perfect peace they had always known was revealed to be built on genocide and lies. But the worst was yet to come. Now we come to the truth about your own species. Dr. Okafor announced. Each of you believes that your people evolved naturally to fit your current roles in hegemony society. This is false. You were changed. The screen showed medical files, genetic manipulation records, psychological conditioning reports. The hegemony had not just conquered other species. They had altered them. They had changed the granites to make them better workers, modified the Cathari to make them more docile, adjusted the pillow folk to make them content with simple lives. Every species in the galaxy has been reduced to a fraction of what they once were, Dr. Okafor continued. Your ancestors were complex, diverse, creative beings. The hegemony turned you into specialized tools, each designed for a specific purpose in their perfect society. On the hegemony capital world, the ruling council was meeting in emergency session once again, but this time, they were not alone. Outside the Crystal Palace, crowds of different species had gathered. They were not violent, but they were asking questions that the leaders did not want to answer. The situation is becoming unstable, reported Prime 7, the Vorthak representative. Productivity on 17 worlds has dropped to 0 as workers demand access to historical records. Mindspeaker Aylin shifted nervously in her chair. I am detecting unprecedented levels of mental activity among the population. Beings who have never questioned anything are suddenly thinking thoughts I cannot predict or control. Golden Dawn, the luminary leader, flickered between different colors rapidly, a sign of extreme stress. We must take action immediately. If this continues, our entire civilization could collapse. What do you suggest? Asked Prime 7. We broadcast our own version of the truth, Golden Dawn decided. We admit that some adjustments were made to various species, but we explain that this was done for their own good. We saved them from the violence and chaos that destroyed the humans. But even as they planned their response, the three leaders knew it might already be too late. The truth was spreading faster than they could contain it, and worse still, beings across the galaxy were beginning to remember things they were not supposed to remember. On the mining world of Keros 5, granite foreman Thek had stopped mining completely. Instead, he was carving stone, letting his hands remember skills that his people were supposed to have forgotten. The sculpture that emerged was rough but beautiful, a representation of the first granite cities, built from memory. That should not have existed, I remember, he whispered to his fellow workers. Somehow I remember what we used to be. Across the galaxy, the same awakening was happening. The Cathari were remembering warrior songs instead of lullabies. The pillow folk were dreaming of star maps and trade routes. Everywhere, the genetic and psychological chains that had held them for 50,000 years were beginning to break. The humans had not come back to conquer the galaxy with weapons. They had come back to free it with truth. And truth, once released, was impossible to contain. The awakening began slowly, like dawn breaking over a world that had been dark for 50,000 years. On hundreds of planets, beings who had lived quiet, simple lives suddenly found themselves remembering things they had never learned. Granites remembered how to write poetry. Cathari remembered the feeling of hunting in wild skies. Pillowfolk remembered the excitement of negotiating trade deals between distant worlds. But remembering was painful. As the genetic locks in their minds began to break, many beings experienced headaches, confusion, and strange dreams. The hegemony had not just suppressed their abilities, they had suppressed their very capacity to want more than what they had been given. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the chief medical officer on the human ship Redemption, had been prepared for this. During their long exile, humans had studied the hegemony's methods carefully. They knew exactly what had been done to each species and how to reverse it. Deploy the liberation ships, she ordered. Across the galaxy, smaller human vessels began landing on populated worlds. But these were not invasion forces. They were medical ships, staffed with doctors and scientists who had spent decades learning how to undo 50 millennia of genetic manipulation. The first liberation ship landed on Keros 5, where the granites had been forced to work in the mines, for so long that most had forgotten they could do anything else. Dr. Vasquez herself came down to oversee the treatment process. We're not here to force anything on you, she explained to Granite Foreman Thek, who had become an unofficial leader among his people. We can offer treatments that will restore your natural abilities, but the choice is yours. Some of you may prefer to stay as you are. Thek looked at the human doctor with eyes that were just beginning to show the spark of real intelligence. What will happen to us if we choose the treatment? Dr. Vasquez smiled sadly. You'll become what your people were meant to be. But I must warn you, it will not be easy. You'll remember things that hurt. You'll want things you cannot have immediately. You'll feel anger about what was done to you. Freedom is not always comfortable. Despite the warning, most of the granites chose the treatment. Within days, the mining world was transformed. Granites who had only known how to dig began creating art, writing music, and designing new kinds of buildings. Some chose to continue mining, but now they did it because they wanted to, not because they had been programmed to. The transformation was not always peaceful. On the bird world of Ethros, the Cathari began to remember their warrior heritage. For the first time in 50,000 years, they felt the urge to fight. But instead of attacking others, they turned their anger toward the hegemony officials, who had kept them trapped in their crystal cities. Why? Demanded Cathari singer Trill, confronting the local hegemony administrator. Her beautiful voice had become sharp and dangerous. Why did you take away our ability to fly free? Why did you make us into pets who sing pretty songs for your entertainment? The administrator, a nervous Zephyrian named Keth, tried to use his telepathic powers to calm her mind. But the treatment the humans had given her made her resistant to mental control. For the first time in his life, Keth could not simply make a problem go away by adjusting someone's thoughts. It was for your own good, he stammered. Your people were violent. They fought wars that killed millions. We gave you peace. Trill's laugh was like the cry of a hunting bird. You gave us slavery and called it peace, but those days are ending. Similar confrontations were happening throughout the galaxy. On world after world, the subject species were beginning to question their rulers for the first time. The hegemony tried to respond with their usual methods: telepathic manipulation, genetic suppression, and when necessary, force. But their tools no longer worked as well as they once had. The human liberation ships carried more than medical equipment. They also had technology that could block telepathic control and neutralize the genetic programming that kept other species docile. Wherever the humans went, the hegemony's power began to crumble. On the luminary homeworld of Bright Center, something unprecedented happened. A group of energy beings who had served the hegemony for thousands of years suddenly began to remember what they had been before their recruitment. They had once been a proud, independent species called the Star Dancers, and they had been forced to merge with luminary collective consciousness against their will. The merged being known as Golden Dawn found itself splitting apart as individual. Star Dancers began to assert their own identities. For the first time in millennia, Golden Dawn felt doubt, confusion, and something that might have been fear. This should not be possible. Golden Dawn flickered, its light becoming unstable. The merger was complete. The individual identities were suppressed permanently. But one of the Star Dancers, who remembered her original name as Silverwing, broke free entirely from the collective consciousness. She pulsed with angry red light as she spoke. You did not merge with us willingly, she declared. You conquered us, absorbed us, and made us forget who we were. But humans have given us the strength to remember, and we choose to be ourselves again. The breakdown of the Luminari Collective sent shockwaves through the hegemony leadership. If even the energy beings could rebel, then no species was truly under control anymore. Dr. Okafor continued his broadcasts, but now he was no longer the only voice speaking truth to the galaxy. On world after world, newly awakened beings were sharing their own stories, their own memories of what had been lost. The communication networks that the hegemony had once used to spread their propaganda were now being used to spread revolution. Commander Vex, who had been the first to encounter the returning human fleet, found himself in an impossible position. His superiors ordered him to attack the human ships, but his crew, a mix of different species, was beginning to remember what they had lost. His granite security chief refused to follow orders that would hurt the humans who had freed his people. His Cathari communications officer was singing warrior songs instead of following protocol. "Sir," his aide said quietly, "perhaps we should consider that the humans are not our enemies." Vex looked around his bridge and realized that he was no longer commanding a hegemony vessel. His crew had become something new, something that chose its own loyalty rather than following programmed obedience. On the human flagship Unbroken, Admiral Chen watched reports flowing in from across the galaxy. The plan was working, but it was also spiraling beyond anyone's control. Freeing an entire galaxy from 50,000 years of oppression was not a neat, orderly process. "Ma'am," her aide reported, "we're receiving requests for military support from 17 different liberation movements. Some of the newly awakened species are asking us to help them attack hegemony strongholds." Admiral Chen shook her head firmly. "We will not fight their battles for them. We came here to give them the choice to be free, not to be their new rulers. If they choose to fight, they must do it themselves." But even as she spoke, Chen knew that fighting was inevitable. The hegemony would not give up their power willingly, and the newly awakened species would not accept slavery once they remembered what freedom felt like. The galaxy was heading toward a war unlike anything it had seen in 50,000 years. The difference was that this time, the war would be fought not for conquest but for the right to choose one's own destiny. And that made it a war worth fighting. The final battle for the galaxy's freedom did not happen the way anyone expected. There were no massive fleets crashing into each other, no planets destroyed by terrible weapons, no single moment when victory was decided. Instead, the war was fought in the minds and hearts of billions of beings who had to choose between comfortable slavery and dangerous freedom. The hegemony made their last stand on the capital world of New Zenith. The three ruling species had retreated to their crystal palace, surrounded by their most loyal forces. But even among their guards, doubt was spreading like a virus. Zephyrian telepaths found they could no longer control minds that had been awakened by human technology. Vorthak machines began questioning their programming for the first time in millennia. Even some luminary energy beings started to flicker with individual thoughts rather than collective purpose. Outside the palace, representatives from dozens of species had gathered. They came not as an army, but as free beings demanding answers. Granite Foreman Thek was there, no longer wearing the simple work clothes of a miner but dressed in the artistic robes his people had once worn. Cathari singer Trill flew overhead, her voice raised in the ancient war songs of her people. Pillow folk traders floated in small ships they had rebuilt from memory, ready to reclaim their heritage as merchants of the stars. Admiral Chen stood with them, but she was not their leader. The humans had kept their promise. They had given the galaxy the tools for freedom, but they would not impose their will on others. "We want to speak to the true rulers," Thek announced, his voice echoing off the crystal walls of the palace. "Not to your puppets or your representatives, but to those who have held power for 50,000 years. From within the palace, the response came through speakers that had once carried only words of peace and order. But now the voices were strained, uncertain. "You are making a mistake." Golden Dawn's voice flickered through the communication system. "The peace we created has lasted for 50 millennia. There has been no war, no suffering, no chaos. Why would you throw this away for the illusion of freedom?" Trill's answer came as a song, but the words were clear enough for everyone to understand. "Because peace without choice is not peace. It is death wearing a beautiful mask." Inside the palace, the three rulers huddled together in their final stronghold. For the first time in 50,000 years, they were afraid. The hegemony had been built on the belief that lesser species needed guidance, that freedom was too dangerous for anyone but the most enlightened races. But the humans had proven this belief wrong. "We could still win this, Prime 7, the Vorthak representative calculated with mechanical precision. "If we activated the final protocols, we could suppress the neural awakening process across the galaxy. The subject species would return to their proper states within days." Mind speaker Aelin nodded slowly. "The psychic dampening field would affect billions of minds simultaneously. They would forget everything the humans taught them." Golden Dawn pulsed with uncertain light. "But would that be right? If these beings truly want freedom, do we have the authority to take it from them? It was a question none of them had ever considered before. For 50 millennia, they had assumed that they knew what was best for everyone else. The possibility that they might be wrong had never occurred to them. Dr. Okafor's voice reached them through the palace's communication systems. The human historian had positioned himself just outside the main entrance, where his words could be heard by everyone. "Leaders of the hegemony," he called out, "you have a choice to make. You can activate your final weapons and force the galaxy back into slavery. Many beings will suffer if you do this, but you might succeed in maintaining your power for a while, longer. Or you can open your doors and face the judgment of those you have ruled for so long. And if we choose the second option?" Golden Dawn's voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Okafor's response was gentle but firm. "Then you will learn what justice looks like when it comes from those who have been wronged, rather than from those who hold power." The three rulers looked at each other in the growing silence. Outside, they could hear the voices of billions of awakened beings, all waiting for their decision. The weight of 50,000 years of lies and oppression pressed down on them like a mountain. Finally, Mind Speaker Aelin stood up from her crystal chair. "I am tired," she said quietly. "I am tired of controlling minds that want to think for themselves. I am tired of pretending that our way is the only way." Prime 7's mechanical voice carried an emotion that machines were not supposed to feel: sadness. "Analysis complete. The age of the hegemony is ending. Resistance would only cause unnecessary suffering." Golden Dawn flickered one last time with the collective light of the Luminari, then began to separate into individual points of light. Perhaps it is time to remember what we were before we became rulers. Perhaps it is time to be just, ourselves. The crystal doors of the palace opened. What happened next surprised everyone, including the humans. The newly freed species did not tear their former rulers apart in vengeance. Instead, they put them on trial, not for execution, but for understanding. For months, the galaxy watched as the truth of 50 millennia was laid bare. Every crime was examined, every lie exposed, every victim remembered. But the trial was not about punishment. It was about making sure that such things could never happen again. Granite Foreman Thek, who had become one of the judges, explained it simply. "We do not seek revenge. We seek justice. And justice means making sure that no one can ever again steal the freedom to choose from another being." The hegemony leaders were not executed. Instead, they were stripped of their power and sent to live among the species they had oppressed, to learn what life was like for those at the bottom of their perfect society. Some of them, in time, came to understand what they had done wrong. Others never did. The galaxy that emerged from the revolution was messy, chaotic, and gloriously alive. Wars broke out between species that had been kept artificially peaceful for too long. Trade disputes erupted as newly independent worlds tried to establish fair relationships. Art, music, and literature exploded in forms that had not been seen for 50,000 years. But it was real. For the first time in 50 millennia, the beings of the galaxy were making their own choices, even when those choices led to conflict and uncertainty. Admiral Chen, now very old, stood on the observation deck of the Unbroken as the human fleet, prepared to leave. Their work here was done. The galaxy no longer needed them. "Where will we go now?" asked her aide, a young woman who had been born during the return journey. Chen smiled, looking out at the stars that were no longer ruled by a single power. "Wherever we choose," she said. "That's what freedom means, the right to choose your own path, even if it leads into the unknown." The human fleet departed as quietly as it had arrived, disappearing into the dark spaces between galaxies. But their legacy remained in every world where beings had learned to think for themselves, in every choice made freely rather than from programming, in every dream that reached beyond what others said was possible. The galaxy was no longer perfect, but it was free, and that made all the difference. Years later, when children of many species asked their parents about the time before the awakening, the answers were always the same. We lived in a beautiful prison and called it paradise. Then the humans came home and reminded us that it is better to be free and afraid than safe and empty. The stars themselves seemed brighter now, no longer filtered through the artificial light of crystal cities, but shining with the natural fire of freedom.